There's loads going on in Psalm 116, and there's no way I'll do it justice in 6 or so minutes, but we can think together about its central question, which is this: how do we respond to our rescue? How do we respond to our rescue? As you read Psalm 116, it's clear that the psalmist has been rescued, and I'm sure that there is a very particular rescue that he has in mind as he writes this psalm. And yet, it can't have escaped your notice that as you read this psalm, his rescue has a lot of similarities to the Christian's rescue from hell for heaven. So we see something of what he was rescued from in verse 3. The cords of death were entangling him. There was nothing that he could do to escape his situation. Then later on in verse 3, he says that he was overcome by distress and sorrow, that the agony of his fate was too much for him to bear. And so he called on the name of the Lord. He called on the name of the Lord to be saved. He was saved, verse 5, when he turned to the one who is gracious, righteous, and full of compassion. And that salvation meant, verse 8, that he was delivered from death, that his eyes were delivered from tears, that his feet were delivered from stumbling. It meant that he was saved, verse 9, so that he may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. And I don't know about you, but as I read those two verses, my mind immediately went to Revelation 7 and the description of heaven that we were looking at last Sunday. A place where we'll be safe, where we will be free from tears, where we will be living in God's presence. Our rescue, you see, it's like the psalmist's rescue. And so if that's true, well, our response should be like the psalmist's response. So how does he respond to his rescue? How should we respond to our rescue? Well, we're going to rush through 5 responses in the rest of this video. But as we do that, I'd love you to have this question in your mind and to be thinking about it. I'd love you to be thinking, which of these responses am I slowest to make and why? Which response am I slowest to make and why? Okay, here we go. Number 1, the psalmist loves the Lord, verse 1. That's the banner headline, the overture for this psalm, the thing from which everything else follows. The psalmist loves the Lord in response to his rescue. Of course he does. Why wouldn't he love him for such a great salvation? Number 2, I told you we were going to be quick. The psalmist kept praying. Verse 2, because he, the Lord, turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. The Lord had provided for the psalmist's biggest need. And so, of course, the psalmist will prayerfully trust him for everything else. He keeps on praying. Number 3, the psalmist tells himself to find rest in God. Maybe he was going through another period of anguish. Maybe his faith in God was wavering. Maybe doubts were creeping in. And so he says to himself, return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. He reminds himself of God's goodness and tells himself to find rest there. Number 4, the psalmist responds by speaking publicly of God's goodness to him. That's what the imagery of verse 13 is trying to draw out as he says, I will lift up the cup of my salvation. I will celebrate all that God has done for me. In the context of the psalm, it's clear he's talking about doing this among God's people. He longs to sing God's praises with his fellow believers. And of course, isn't that one of the great sorrows of lockdown, that we aren't able to celebrate God's goodness together in the same place? But as well as wanting to speak of God's goodness among God's people, we'll want to speak of our salvation to those who aren't yet his people, so that they may join us in celebrating together all that God has done. Fifthly and finally, the psalmist responds by vowing to serve his God, which we see in verses 14 and 18. And this service, it's not a tit for tat, you scratch my back, so I better scratch your back sort of service. It's a Romans 12 verse 1 service. It's what Paul means when he writes to the Christians in Rome, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. This service is a worshipful, thankful response to God's merciful treatment of us. Wow, well, there you go. That's the end of our whistle-stop tour of the psalmist's 5 responses to God's rescue of him. And as that whistle-stop tour comes to the end, as we think about those 5 responses that should be our responses, let me leave you with that question I asked, just to have a think about now. Which of these responses are you slowest to make, and why?